The wind, a malevolent sculptor of snowdrifts and misery, clawed at the ill-fitting door. Beyond its thin planks, the world was a canvas of unforgiving white, an endless, biting hunger. Inside, the last embers of the hearth sputtered, mirroring the fragile spark of hope in Alara's chest. Her breath rasped, each shallow gasp a battle waged against an unseen enemy within her lungs. The chill seeping through the walls was a persistent, gnawing ache that had become as much a part of her as her own failing heartbeat. Her two children, Lily and Thomas, small, ghost-like figures swallowed by oversized, mended clothes, huddled beside her cot, their eyes wide with a fear that transcended their tender years. The silent question in their gaze, the one she fought daily to answer without words, was growing louder, more insistent. What will become of us? They had knocked on his door, the ramshackle cabin a mile down the desolate trail, a place most folks avoided, whispering of its solitary occupant, Silas. "Can you buy our parrot? Our mom is sick," they had said, their small voices barely audible above the rising gale. Silas, a man forged from granite and solitude, recognized them instantly. The gaunt faces, the desperation that clung to them like the snow to their threadbare coats, mirrored the image he carried of their mother, Alara, a woman whose quiet dignity had always seemed too fragile for this unforgiving land. The parrot, a vibrant splash of emerald and sapphire against the dull winter gray, perched on Lily's shoulder, its head cocked, one intelligent eye fixed on him, seemingly understanding the gravity of the silent plea. Its very presence was a testament to the warmth and life that once had thrived in their small home, a stark contrast to the encroaching death. Alara had awoken to the silence of their absence, a primal fear seizing her chest, colder than the fever. Her children, her desperate, unspoken command to them had been a last resort. She knew Silas was their only hope, yet shame burned as fiercely as the fever in her veins. To send her children, to expose their desperation, their family's ruin, to the eyes of a man already an outcast, was a humiliation that felt worse than the cold hand of death itself. But the parrot, Peregrine, was all they had left of any value, a gift from her late husband, a flash of color and memory from a life now lost to the winds of misfortune. Selling him was a surrender, an amputation of a cherished past, but it was also a desperate gamble for a future, however uncertain. She listened, straining, for the sounds of their return, the silence of the cabin stretching, suffocating. The coughs racked her body, each one a fresh wound. She was failing. She knew it. The doctor was miles away, across impassable snowdrifts, and money, once a distant worry, had vanished like breath on the winter air. Her husband's small claim had yielded little, then nothing, and the relentless elements had claimed their crops, their livestock, their strength. She had fought, clawed, and scraped, but the land had finally claimed her. The children, innocent, unwitting witnesses to her slow decline, were her only reason to resist, her only source of strength. Yet even that strength was ebbing, leaving her adrift in a sea of encroaching darkness. Her eyes drifted to the empty perch in the corner, a pang of loss already sharp. Peregrine, her husband's last tangible link, a creature of vibrant life. If his sale could buy her children another day, another meal, then the pain was a small price. The sound of the door creaking open, followed by the familiar scuff of small boots, brought a rush of relief that almost buckled her fading consciousness. Lily and Thomas stood in the doorway, their faces flushed with cold, Peregrine still perched on Lily's shoulder, a beacon of bewildering normality. But then a shadow loomed behind them. Silas. He filled the doorway, a broad, silent silhouette against the blinding snow. His presence, unbidden and unexpected, brought a jolt of both alarm and a strange, unfamiliar comfort. He did not speak. He merely stepped inside, the cold air swirling around him, and set a small, heavy sack on the rough-hewn table. It clinked with the sound of coin. Alara's breath hitched. She had sent her children to sell their last precious memory, and he, the reclusive stranger, had come with them. He had not merely bought Peregrine, he had brought him back. Why? The unspoken question hung heavy in the air between them, a fragile bridge connecting their disparate worlds. He ignored her, turning instead to the children. "Your mother needs the doctor." Now his voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection, yet it carried an undeniable authority. He looked at Alara then, his gaze unreadable, acknowledging the severity of her state, the desperation in her eyes. She felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare of her pride and self-sufficiency. Yet, beneath the shame, a flicker of something else began to stir, a tentative, desperate hope. The chill within Alara deepened, a frigid tide pulling her further from the waking world. Days blurred into a feverish haze, punctuated by the relentless cough that tore at her throat and the suffocating weight on her chest. Sounds reached her as if from a great distance, the quiet murmur of her children, the crackle of a fire that seemed perpetually fed, the rhythmic chop of an axe echoing from the woods. Silas. He was still there. His presence, an unyielding anchor in the storm of her illness, was both confounding and strangely reassuring. He had not left after returning Peregrine. He had stayed, an uninvited guardian, tending the fire, ensuring the children were fed, his movements precise and quiet. He never spoke much, his communication a language of action would piled high, a steaming bowl of broth placed within reach, the careful tending of the fire. Alara watched him through slits of heavy eyelids, her mind clouded but observing. He was an outsider, whispered about in the distant settlement, a man who kept to himself, whose past was shrouded in rumor. Yet, here he was, performing acts of unexpected kindness with the stoic efficiency of a man accustomed to hard necessities. He moved around their small cabin with a practiced ease, his large frame somehow not clumsy in the cramped space. He cooked over the open hearth, simple, nourishing stews that brought warmth back to the children's pale faces. He even tended to Peregrine, refilling the bird's seed and water, the parrot seeming to accept his presence without alarm. Her pride, a fierce, brittle thing that had sustained her through months of hardship, chafed under the weight of his unsolicited aid. She was accustomed to fending for herself, to relying solely on her own two hands. To be dependent, to be so utterly vulnerable, felt like a betrayal of her own strength. Yet the alternative was unthinkable. The children, they needed her, and in her current state she was useless. She was a burden. A tear tracked a path through the grime on her temple, hot and stinging. He noticed. She knew he did, though his gaze was brief, his expression unreadable. He simply pushed the broth bowl closer. The blizzard raged outside, a white shroud over the world, cutting them off entirely. The drifts rose higher than the windows, trapping them in a small, flickering island of warmth. Silas worked tirelessly, chopping wood, his axe strokes resonating through the cabin, a steady beat against the howling wind. He seemed impervious to the cold, his face grim, his movements tireless. He had even ventured out in the worst of the storm, returning hours later, snow-caked and grim-faced, carrying a small, dark bottle. Medicine. He had ridden into the teeth of the blizzard, to the distant doctor, for her. A wave of profound gratitude, so unexpected, so overwhelming, washed over her, momentarily eclipsing the shame. Peregrine, perched on his stand beside the hearth, would occasionally squawk, a sudden burst of sound in the quiet cabin, startling the children, but always drawing Silas's gaze. The parrot was a vivid splash of life, a defiant burst of color against the monochrome backdrop of their struggle. Alara found herself watching Silas watching the bird, a silent connection forming between the man and the animal that was as perplexing as it was comforting. It was in these small, observed moments that Alara began to see beyond the rumors, beyond the gruff exterior, to something deeper, something profoundly human. He wasn't doing this for praise or for any perceived reward. He was simply doing what was necessary, his silent strength a bulwark against the forces that threatened to consume them. The raw, desperate struggle for survival was slowly forging an improbable bond, stripping away societal pretense and leaving only the stark, undeniable truth of shared humanity. The battle for breath intensified, her lungs burning, each shallow inhale a desperate struggle against the tightening vice in her chest. Alara drifted in and out of consciousness, her world a distorted kaleidoscope of pain and fleeting, vivid hallucinations. The faces of her children swam before her, their tiny hands clutching hers, their voices whispers carried on the wind. The cold was a living thing, seeping into her bones, threatening to extinguish the last flicker of her life. She was dying. The thought, clear and unvarnished, brought with it a terror not for herself, but for them, her helpless little ones. What would happen to them, alone in this frozen wilderness, orphaned in the heart of winter? Silas moved with a grim urgency. He had built up the fire to a roaring inferno, the cabin air thick with the scent of pine and sweat. He was a blur of motion, boiling water, tearing cloths into strips, his usually stoic face etched with a rare, desperate concern. He pressed a warm, wet cloth to her forehead, the heat a temporary reprieve from the internal inferno. He spooned the bitter medicine into her mouth, coaxing her to swallow, his large hand gentle beneath her chin. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant, solid weight, a silent vow that she would not face this alone. He sat by her cot for hours, his gaze fixed on her, willing her to fight, to breathe. The children, sensing the escalating crisis, huddled in their small beds, their wide eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, their fear palpable. A particularly violent coughing fit seized Alara, leaving her weak and gasping, her vision blurring at the edges. She felt herself slipping, the darkness pressing in, inviting her to succumb. But then, a voice, sharp and clear, cut through the haze. "Peregrine, good bird." It was Lily, her voice trembling. The parrot, sensing the shift in the cabin's energy, had squawked, a loud, attention-grabbing call that briefly broke the suffocating tension. Silas looked up, his eyes meeting Alara's. In that moment, a silent exchange passed between them, a desperate plea from her, an unspoken promise from him. He would not let her go. Not yet. He worked through the night, his vigilance unwavering. When her fever spiked, he packed snow around her head, heedless of the freezing cold that clung to his own hands. When her breathing became ragged, he propped her up, rubbing her back, his touch surprisingly tender. He was a man accustomed to hard labor, to brute strength, but he applied a delicate precision to her care, as if she were a fragile, precious thing. He moved from tending her to checking on the children, then back to the fire, a relentless cycle of protection and care. He was a lone sentinel against the vast, indifferent wilderness, protecting their fragile bubble of life. Towards dawn, a fragile shift occurred. The coughs, though still present, were less violent. Her breathing, though still shallow, was less strained. The fever, still high, seemed to have peaked and was, ever so slowly, receding. Alara opened her eyes fully, the images clear now, the pain duller. Silas sat beside her, his head bowed, his broad shoulders slumped slightly with exhaustion. He had saved her. She knew it, with a certainty that resonated deep within her weakened body. He had brought her back from the precipice, not with grand words or promises, but with quiet, tireless action. Her pride, which had once felt so essential, now seemed a trivial thing. All that mattered was the steady rise and fall of her children's chests, and the silent, unassuming man who had defied death itself to ensure their survival. The world outside remained a formidable, frozen adversary, but inside, a seed of new possibility had been planted, watered by the quiet heroism of a man who asked for nothing in return. Slowly, agonizingly, Alara began to mend. The fever receded like a nightmare, leaving her weak and emaciated, but undeniably alive. The rasp in her breath lessened with each passing day, replaced by the tentative comfort of full, deep inhales. The silence of the cabin, once suffocating, now held the quiet hum of recovery, punctuated by the children's hushed games and the occasional, cheerful squawk from Peregrine. The parrot, symbol of loss and then of unexpected reprieve, had become a vibrant, living testament to their survival. He would often mimic the children's laughter, or a snatch of a tune Alara used to hum, his voice a bright thread in the fabric of their healing days. Silas remained. He had not left, even as the worst of the blizzard broke and the trails began to clear. His presence, initially a source of bewildering discomfort, had settled into an unspoken routine, an essential part of their small, unlikely household. He would be gone for hours, trapping or cutting wood, but he always returned, bringing with him the fresh scent of pine and the promise of warmth and sustenance. He mended the cabin's leaky roof, repaired the broken latch on the door, strengthened the weak points that had allowed the relentless winter to invade their home. He worked with a quiet competence, his gaze rarely meeting hers, yet his awareness of her, of the children, was palpable. Alara watched him, a quiet study. The community, she knew, still whispered about him, an outsider, a loner, too rough, too reclusive. But she had seen beyond the surface, witnessed the unwavering core of his character in the crucible of her illness. He was a man of actions, not words. His kindness conveyed through the steady supply of wood, the warmth of the fire, the secure feeling of the mended cabin. He never offered pity, only practical support, an acknowledgement of their shared struggle against a harsh world. Her initial shame had long since evaporated, replaced by a deep, quiet gratitude and a burgeoning respect for this man who had, without question or expectation, become their unlikely protector. One afternoon, as the sun, a pale, watery disk, finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow, Alara found her voice. "Silas," she said, her voice still weak, but steady. He paused, turning from splitting logs, his axe resting against the stump. He looked at her, his eyes, usually unreadable, holding a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you," she managed, the words feeling utterly inadequate for the debt she owed. He simply nodded, a slight inclination of his head, his gaze sweeping over her. Then the children, then Peregrine, perched proudly on his stand, mimicking a distant hawk's cry. He remained, not as a charity, but as a quiet, vital presence. The lines of hardship on Alara's face began to soften, replaced by a quiet determination. She started to move about the cabin, then venturing outside, her strength slowly returning. The world was still unforgiving, but she was no longer alone in facing it. Silas's unspoken partnership had brought not just survival, but a quiet dignity, a sense of shared purpose. Peregrine, the parrot whose sail had been the catalyst for their desperate plea, now seemed to embody their renewed spirit, a vibrant splash of life against the lingering gray of winter, a symbol of a past preserved and a future, however uncertain, that now held the fragile promise of hope. The children, no longer living in constant fear, began to laugh more freely, their innocence tentatively reclaimed. The stark, desolate land still stretched around them, but within the small cabin, a different kind of warmth had taken root, nurtured by shared hardship, quiet strength, and the unspoken understanding between two solitary souls.